It's seed starting season, and what comes with that is a whole slew of do's and don'ts. Many have become common knowledge, practices passed down through the ages. The only thing? Many aren't true. So let's talk about some common seed starting myths that you can stop doing this season. When it comes to seed starting, time is of the essence. And not only is it an exciting time in a gardener's year, but it can also be pretty anxiety inducing. When do I start? How much longer should I wait? What if I start too early? What if I start too late? It's enough to drive you mad. To ease your concern, some people will tell you to start now. They'll tell you that starting early will ensure your plants have grown big and strong before getting transplanted outside. Don't listen. Starting seeds as early as possible is not the answer. For the vast majority of us, the intention is to give our plants a head start indoors and then move them outside to grow and flourish. And if we start them too early, they're going to struggle. These plants want to be outside. They want access to sun, rain, wind, soil, even bugs. They're not meant to be indoors long term, and you don't want them to be inside any longer than they need to be. So check your seed packets. Consult sowing and transplanting timing on a site that you trust. Take this random gardener's word for it. And keep your seedlings healthy by ensuring you're not starting them too early. Which brings us to the next myth that you can toss in the bin. A huge caveat to myth number one, huge enough to be a myth worth addressing on its own, is this idea that seed packets are some holy grail of gardening knowledge, never to be questioned or disobeyed. Nope. Seed companies mean well, and they do what they can, but they can't possibly provide all information to all people. If they tried, the back of a seed packet would be a mess with contradictory info. So they do their best, and they do a pretty good job generally speaking, but one of the things most gardeners can afford to do when starting seeds is ignore the recommended timing on the pack. Well, not ignore, but add at least a week. If it says to start your seeds 6 weeks before last frost, start them 7 weeks before. Maybe even consider 8 weeks. Why? Well, first, most seed packet instructions won't take into account the week or so you're hardening off your seedlings. This process is super important to ensure your plants don't suffer from shock when being transplanted. So to account for that extra week, you've got to add that time to your sowing schedule. Second, predicting last frost is not an exact science. Climate and weather patterns are very well known, but they're exactly that, patterns. Sometimes things don't work out exactly as predicted, which is why if you scroll through the frost dates for your zone, you'll find a range of a couple weeks. This range opens up possibilities for you. Suppose you started your seeds on time according to the package, say 6 weeks, but then you had an early spring, and last frost actually ended up happening 4 weeks after you started your seeds. Now you're playing catch up. And you're not even 2 weeks behind. You're actually more like 3 weeks behind. Why? Because you still have to account for that extra week to harden off your seedlings. And this is where myths 1 and 2 converge. You don't want to start your seeds too early, but you do want to start them earlier than the seed packet says. But again, we're just talking about an extra week or so. We don't want to go much further than that. We've all been there. We picked out our seeds for the coming season, got them sown on time, and nothing. No sign of life. And it's been a week, maybe even longer. I guess the seeds weren't viable, too old or damaged somehow. Duds. Not so fast. This can happen for multiple reasons, and it might have nothing to do with the seeds at all. The ideal environment for seeds is the right soil, proper watering, light, humidity, and warmth if necessary. Missing or deviating meaningfully from any of these things could be the reason why your seeds aren't germinating, and different seeds have different requirements in order to emerge. Check the moisture level. Is your soil dry? Spray it with a little bit of water. Did you dome your tray? Does it have condensation on it? If not, you might need to add some water. How's the temperature of the soil? Generally speaking, the soil will be room temperature. If it's a little cooler in the room where you're starting your seeds might take a little longer to germinate. Or in some cases, they might not germinate at all. Seeds have ideal conditions for germinating. But if you don't perfectly mimic those conditions, don't worry, that doesn't mean all hope is lost. I've had pepper seeds that took so long to germinate that I gave up on them, and I started different seeds in those cells, and then the pepper seedlings started to emerge. Take some time and see what happens. Show a little bit of patience. This is also a good reason why you should start your seeds a week or two earlier than what the seed packet says. Another reason a gardener might have trouble with germination, and the next seed starting myth on our list, is that you should bury your seeds deeply in order to promote growth and build stronger roots. No, don't do that. Generally speaking, you can trust the seed companies on this one. If you look across your seed packets, you'll notice a trend. The bigger the seeds, the deeper you plant them. Typically, you want to sow your seed at a depth of about 1.5 to 2 times the size of the seed itself. That's why some of the tiniest seeds, like this black strawberry tomato, have a sowing depth of only 1/8 of an inch. That's 3 millimeters. Very shallow, basically sowing the seeds on the surface and then providing a light dusting of soil just to barely cover them. But don't think that all you need to know about seed planting depth is the relative largeness or smallness of a given seed. Let's get sciencey for a minute.
Science!
Here's a fun word, photoblastic. Photoblastic describes how a seed reacts to exposure to light. Some seeds require light to germinate. We call these positive photoblastic or photophilic. Some other seeds will not germinate if exposed to light. They need darkness in order to grow. We call these negative photoblastic or photophobic. Some seeds can germinate in either light or dark conditions. We call these non-photoblastic. Do you see where I'm going here? The myth that we're talking about states that the deeper you sow a seed, the stronger it will become. Well, if you're trying to grow a seed that needs light to germinate, then that's just a big pile of wrong. A seed that needs light to germinate must be what's called surface sown, meaning that you're sowing it on the surface. Surface sowing gives these seeds exposure to light, whether from the sun if you're starting them in a south-facing window, or from a grow light as part of your indoor gardening setup. Tomato seeds, for example, need darkness in order to germinate, so you need to make sure that you're burying the seeds. The contact with soil and moisture is enough to activate these seeds, and then when it's ready, it's going to poke through the surface of the soil to start being fed by the sun through photosynthesis. Then and only then will your tomatoes start requiring light in order to grow strong. Now on the other side, a plant like dill is positive photoblastic. It needs light in order to germinate. So if you were to bury your dill seed, you wouldn't see any germination. Your seed would just stay underground, eventually rot and become part of your soil structure. When you surface sow your dill seed, then it has the 3 things that it needs: light, water, and soil. That will activate the seed. The seed will then sprout and you'll have your dill. And if you don't give it the light that it needs in order to germinate, it's never going to grow. Ever had a difficult time getting lettuce to sprout? What about those times you tried to grow celery? I remember when the only way I could grow herbs like oregano, thyme, rosemary, and lavender was to buy seedlings from a nursery. Once they bolted and flowered, I started to find little herb plants all over the place. I wonder why. So no, absolutely do not buy into the idea that planting your seeds deeply will somehow give you super plants. Check your seed packs for planting depth requirements, or look it up online before sowing. You'll save yourself a lot of head scratching. The last seed starting myth that we'll talk about today is one that I took to heart for years, and it significantly shortened my harvest window. You'll find so many resources out there and hear from so many gardeners that whatever you do, don't start your beans indoors. The roots are too fragile, they'll tell you. You'll damage it while transplanting and won't get any beans this season. And they tell you the same thing about other vining plants, like cucumbers and squash. Nah. Not only can you successfully start these plants indoors and transplant them without harming them, the best crop of beans I ever grew were from beans that I started indoors and transplanted a few weeks later. And this squash patch, filled with zucchini, yellow squash, and patty pan, started out in the warm confines of my basement. Just be careful when transplanting. That's all it takes. Be gentle with your plants. But as long as you have confidence that you're not being too rough with them, go ahead and start them inside. Don't let them go root bound in the pot. Make sure that you harden them off, and take care not to rip the roots when you're planting. You'll do great. Now there's some credence to some of the plants that make the list of those which you shouldn't be moving after you've gotten them started. In general, I find it best practice to direct sow my root vegetables. Potatoes are a great example. Boil them, mash them, stick them in a stew, but don't start these in a container you're not finishing them in. Same goes for radish, but those grow so quickly. Some you can harvest in as little as 25 days that I just don't see the point in growing them indoors. Beets and carrots, root vegetables just like radish and potato, but you can be successful starting these indoors if you want, even though you're told not to. I stick to direct sowing mine, but you can start them early if you want. A big reason I don't bother is because these are cool season plants which can be sown pretty much once your garden's soil can be worked, even earlier in a cold frame or hoop house if you've got one. The main idea with starting seeds indoors is to get a jump on the season, meaning that you're largely starting seeds to plants that can't handle the frost outside. With indoor seed starting, you're primarily manufacturing a favorable growing environment for your summer veg. Your tomatoes, peppers, and squash can use and appreciate the extra time. But your cool season crops, they don't need it. But if you want to start them inside, go ahead. I start some lettuces and brassicas inside late winter, so I have some decently sized plants ready to plant right at the beginning of the season. That's because it's the first step in my succession planting. As soon as I transplant my seedlings, I direct sow the same plants. But no, rest assured, plenty of the plants that we're told cannot be started indoors can in fact be started indoors. Just like everything we do as gardeners, have a reason why. A jump start, succession planting, experimentation. If you have a reason to do or try something, go for it. So go ahead, get your seeds started with confidence, and I encourage you to disregard these common seed starting myths. Happy growing.